In the summer of 1587, a ship from England reached the shores of what would one day become North Carolina. On board were more than 100 men, women, and children, English settlers, pioneers of a new world. They were led by John White, an artist and explorer entrusted by Sir Walter Raleigh to establish England's first permanent colony in the Americas. The location they chose was Roanoke Island, a narrow strip of land off the coast surrounded by dense forests and shallow sounds. For the settlers, it was both promise and peril. The land was fertile, the waters rich with fish, yet it was isolated, vulnerable, and surrounded by native tribes whose reactions ranged from cautious friendship to outright hostility. White's daughter, Eleanor Dare, gave birth soon after their arrival. The child, Virginia Dare, became the first English baby born in the New World, a symbol of hope for the colony's future. But behind the joy lay shadows. Supplies were already running low. Relations with some of the local tribes had turned violent, and the specter of starvation haunted the settlers' nights. By late 1587, the situation had grown desperate. The colonists begged John White to return to England for more provisions. He resisted. He knew the risks of leaving his family behind, but in the end, he had no choice. He promised the colonists that he would return quickly, before winter, with food and reinforcements. But fate had other plans. England was on the brink of war with Spain. When White reached England, the Spanish Armada loomed. All ships were commandeered for defense. White was forbidden to return. Weeks turned into months, months into years. It would be 3 years before he saw Roanoke again. In August 1590, White finally returned. His heart pounded as his ship anchored near the island. He imagined his daughter rushing to greet him, his granddaughter Virginia running across the sand. But when he and his men stepped ashore, a silence, more terrifying than any storm, greeted them. The settlement was deserted. The houses stood empty, weather-beaten, but intact. Tools were scattered, as if abandoned mid-use. There was no signs of struggle, no bodies, no graves, nothing. It was as if the colony had been swallowed by the earth. Over the centuries, the word carved into the tree became an obsession, CROATOAN. To some, it was a straightforward clue, pointing to the island now known as Hatteras, where descendants of the colonists might have lived on. To others, it was something darker. The word CROATOAN began to take on supernatural overtones. It appeared in the writings of Edgar Allan Poe before his mysterious death. It was linked to shipwrecks, disappearances, and curses. The colony's fate became more than history. It became folklore, a story told to frighten, to warn, to unsettle. By the 20th century, Roanoke had become a symbol of America's unsolved past. Textbooks listed it as a lost colony. Writers spun tales of ghosts and curses. Television shows and horror films resurrected the mystery for each new generation. But historians and archaeologists continued to search, digging in the soil of Hatteras Island, scanning the coastline, poring over ancient maps, always chasing an answer, always coming empty-handed. Until the 21st century, until the emergence of new evidence, until whispers began to spread that perhaps the mystery was closer to being solved than anyone dared to imagine. For over 4 centuries, the fate of Roanoke's lost colonists remained a void in history, a silence where lives should have been, an emptiness that echoed louder with each passing generation. But in 2025, scientists would finally claim to have uncovered the truth, and the world would listen.
For centuries after the disappearance of the Roanoke colonists, the world was left with silence. 115 men, women, and children had simply vanished, leaving behind only weathered houses, abandoned tools, and a single word carved into a tree. The absence of bodies, bones, or graves invited speculation. With nothing but questions to guide them, historians, storytellers, and generations of Americans built a labyrinth of theories, each one darker and more haunting than the last. The first and most common explanation was starvation. The settlers arrived with limited supplies and faced an unforgiving wilderness. Roanoke's soil was thin and sandy, its crops difficult to sustain. Relations with some of the local tribes had soured, cutting off the possibility of trading for food. As months passed, hunger would have gnawed at their bodies, hollowing them from within. Some theorists imagined families huddled around empty wooden tables, watching the candles burn lower, listening to the cries of children with nothing to eat. Starvation could have claimed them slowly, silently, until no one was left. Yet, if they had all died of hunger, where were the grapes? Where were the bones? Why was there no sign of mass death? Another possibility was disease. In the 16th century, sickness spread like fire, carried by insects, contaminated water, or the settlers themselves. Dysentery, malaria, or plague could have swept through the small colony, killing dozens in a matter of weeks. Imagine the cabins filled with feverish bodies, settlers coughing into blood-stained cloths, the stench of illness rising with the smoke of their lanterns. Entire families could have perished, their corpses hidden hastily in shallow pits or burned to contain infection. But again, no evidence remained. No mass burial sites, no clear signs of a devastating epidemic. Others believed the settlers had been wiped out by violence. The island was surrounded by native tribes, some of whom had already clashed with the English in earlier years. To those who embraced this theory, it was easy to imagine warriors advancing from the forest at dusk, their torches glowing, their shadows stretching long across the settlement. A sudden assault could have overwhelmed the colonists, their bodies carried away, their homes left to rot. Yet, if there had been such a massacre, the signs would be undeniable. Burned structures, shattered weapons, bloodstains on the earth. The absence of those traces weakened the theory, though whispers of conflict never truly died. Still, others suggested a quieter fate, that the colonists were not killed but absorbed. According to this view, the desperate English abandoned their fragile settlement and sought refuge among friendlier tribes. The word carved into the tree, CROATOAN, might not have been a warning, but a destination. Perhaps the colonists walked south, carrying their children in weary arms, and joined the CROATOAN people on Hatteras Island. Over time, their language, customs, and bloodlines could have blended into the native community until the English identity disappeared altogether. Generations later, reports emerged of native people with gray eyes and European features. Was this coincidence or the faint echo of Roanoke's lost settlers living on in another form? And then came the darker stories. As decades passed, the absence of evidence turned Roanoke into fertile ground for folklore. Some whispered of supernatural punishment, that the colony was cursed from the moment it was founded. The word CROATOAN itself took on eerie significance. It appeared again in history, linked to unexplained vanishings. The writer Edgar Allan Poe supposedly muttered it on his deathbed. Ships lost at sea, prisoners gone without a trace, even the disappearance of famed illusionist Harry Houdini were all at one point connected to the mysterious word CROATOAN, as if it carried a lingering curse that reached through centuries. Paranormal enthusiasts imagined that the colonists had been swallowed by forces beyond human understanding. Some spoke of ghostly figures wandering the forests, shadows of the settlers trapped between worlds. Others suggested they had been taken by otherworldly beings, spirited away into darkness. Over time, Roanoke became less a historical puzzle and more a ghost story, one that children whispered at night, one that storytellers revived to send chills down the spine. Even in modern times, television series and horror films kept these theories alive, blending history with fiction. The Lost Colony was presented as everything from victims of cannibalism to sacrifices in occult rituals. The truth remained elusive, and so the legend grew. But beneath all the speculation, scholars continued to search for facts. Archaeologists dug into the soil of Roanoke and Hatteras, searching for pottery, weapons, or fragments of English life. Historians pored over maps from the Elizabethan age, some of which contained strange symbols, marks that seemed to hint at hidden locations. Anthropologists studied oral traditions of native tribes, hoping to find traces of English settlers in their stories. Each discovery offered a hint, but never a conclusion. And so the mystery lingered. Was it famine? Was it disease? Was it slaughter? Was it assimilation? Or was it something far stranger? A disappearance that defied natural explanation. Each theory had strengths, each had flaws, but none could silence the questions that haunted Roanoke for more than 400 years. By the early 21st century, the mystery of Roanoke was not merely an academic question, it was a cultural obsession. Theories filled bookshelves, documentaries, and internet forums, and still, the empty settlement, the carved word, and the silence of the island stood as defiance against certainty. Yet in 2025, that silence would finally be challenged. New evidence would emerge, evidence some believed answered the riddle at last. But for centuries before that revelation, the world could only speculate, spinning theories to fill the void left by one of history's greatest vanishings.
For centuries, Roanoke remained a mystery preserved in silence. But the 21st century brought with it new tools, new science, and a renewed determination to find answers. Archaeologists returned to the Carolina coast with ground-penetrating radar, soil chemistry analyses, and advanced dating techniques. What once could only be guessed at through broken pottery and faded maps could now be tested, measured, and proven. Slowly, pieces of a puzzle began to surface. In the early 2000s, researchers uncovered fragments of English pottery, not only on Roanoke, but also on nearby Hatteras Island, the very place once called CROATOAN. These shards suggested that the colonists may have left the island after all, traveling south as the single carved word implied. But skeptics argued the fragments might have been traded or brought by later settlers. The evidence was intriguing, but not decisive. By the 2010s, attention turned to old maps preserved in the British Museum. One Elizabethan chart, drawn by John White himself, contained curious hidden symbols beneath patches of paper. Using ultraviolet light, researchers revealed what looked like a fort marked on the mainland, west of Roanoke. Was this the true destination of the colonists? The discovery reignited debate, but excavation of the area revealed little beyond scattered artifacts. Once again, certainty slipped through historians' hands. Then came the discoveries of the 2020s. On Hatteras Island, archaeologists uncovered something extraordinary. Tiny fragments of iron, known as hammer scale, left behind by blacksmiths as they forged tools. These fragments were not of native origin. They matched techniques used in 16th century England. If settlers had truly integrated with the Croatoan people, this was precisely the kind of evidence they would have left behind. Blacksmithing, ironwork, the unmistakable fingerprints of English colonists living and working far from their original settlement. In addition, skeletal remains found in nearby burial grounds were subjected to DNA testing. Some showed genetic markers more consistent with Europeans than with indigenous populations of the region. The results were limited, the sample size small, but the findings were startling nonetheless. Was this the faint echo of Roanoke's lost colonists merging into a new lineage? And then, in early 2025, researchers announced what many claimed was the breakthrough that finally solved the mystery. Combining archaeological evidence, DNA analysis, and oral histories passed down through native communities, they concluded that the Roanoke colonists did not vanish into thin air. They had moved to Croatoan Island, today known as Hatteras, and had assimilated into the community there. The word carved into the tree was not a cryptic warning, but a simple statement of fact. This is where we have gone. For scientists, this conclusion brought closure to a mystery that had lingered for more than 400 years. Headlines erupted across the world. Roanoke mystery finally solved. Newspapers and websites declared the case closed, pointing to the combination of blacksmithing evidence, English artifacts, and genetic traces as the final proof. Documentaries rushed to frame the story as a triumph of science, the end of one of history's greatest puzzles. But not everyone was satisfied. Some scholars argued that the evidence, though compelling, was still circumstantial. The hammer scale could have been brought later, the genetic markers explained by other means. The oral histories, though powerful, were vulnerable to interpretation. Solved was too strong a word, they insisted. History is rarely so neat, and mysteries rarely resolve so cleanly. Yet for the public, the announcement carried weight. After centuries of speculation, of horror stories and supernatural whispers, there was finally a narrative that made sense. The colonists had not been slaughtered, cursed, or stolen away by the supernatural. They had survived, if only for a time, by joining with neighbors who offered safety when England could not. Their fate was not disappearance, but transformation, an English colony reborn within a native community. Still, questions lingered. If the colonists had indeed integrated with the CROATOAN, why were no clear written records left behind? Why had John White not found them when he returned in 1590? Why had the carved word been left as their only message? And perhaps most haunting of all, if they had survived, how long did they endure? Did Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the New World, live into adulthood among the Croatoan people? Or did the settlement's hardships eventually overwhelm them anyway? In the end, the 2025 discovery gave us something we had lacked for 4 centuries: a plausible, evidence-based explanation. The lost colony was not lost at all. It had been hiding in plain sight, its traces scattered in soil, in bloodlines, in stories whispered from generation to generation. Scientists called it a solution. Historians called it progress. But mystery still clung to Roanoke like mist over the ocean. For some, the story remains unfinished. The colonists of Roanoke may never speak to us directly. Their voices are gone, their homes empty, their fate only partially revealed. And yet, in the fragments of iron, in the DNA of descendants, in the words carved into ancient trees, they left a message, not of disappearance, but of endurance. Not of silence, but of survival. In 2025, the world was told the mystery was solved. But whether that word meant truth or simply comfort is a question that lingers still.
For centuries, the lost colony of Roanoke has haunted the imagination of historians, archaeologists, and ordinary people who wondered how 115 men, women, and children could vanish without leaving a trace. In 2025, headlines around the world declared the riddle solved at last. Archaeologists pointed to fragments of blacksmithing evidence on Hatteras Island, genetic traces in bones buried nearby, and oral traditions of the Croatoan people as proof that the colonists had survived by joining with their neighbors. Newspapers announced closure. Documentaries spoke of triumph, and for many, the mystery seemed finally at rest. But was it truly solved? Or was the so-called solution simply a story polished enough to comfort, but not solid enough to convince? When we peel back the layers, we find that significant gaps remain, unanswered questions that may never be silenced. Consider first the archaeological evidence. The discovery of hammer scale fragments, tiny bits of iron that fall when metal is struck in a forge, was indeed compelling. It suggested that English blacksmithing had occurred on Hatteras Island, something the Croatoan people had not practiced before contact. Yet, archaeologists cannot prove that these fragments came directly from the Roanoke colonists. Iron could have been transported by later settlers, traded among tribes, or even deposited by shipwreck survivors. The soil does not speak in complete sentences. It only whispers, and we interpret its fragments. That whisper may align with the story of assimilation, but it does not prove it beyond doubt. Then there is the question of DNA. Testing skeletal remains found in nearby sites revealed markers that seemed closer to European origin than to purely indigenous ancestry. But again, the sample size was painfully small, and contamination is always a risk in open soil. The results offered a possibility, not a certainty. Did those bones truly belong to descendants of the colonists, or to later Europeans who intermarried with native communities centuries afterward? Without a direct genetic link to known descendants in England, the evidence remains circumstantial. The oral traditions of the Croatoan people themselves are perhaps the most persuasive and yet the most difficult to pin down. Stories of pale-skinned ancestors and outsiders merging into the tribe have been passed down for generations. These voices matter deeply, but oral history evolves, reshaped by time, translation, and cultural survival. What began as memory may have become myth, or a blending of multiple migrations into one narrative. Oral history are invaluable, yet they cannot stand alone as final proof when the archaeological record remains fragmented. And then there is John White's return in 1590. If the colonists had truly relocated to Croatoan Island, why did White not find them there? His own daughter? His granddaughter? His friends? Would they not have rushed to greet him if they were alive only a few miles away? The defenders of the assimilation theory argued that storms prevented White from searching further, that he was forced to abandon his efforts by impatient sailors. That is true, but does it fully explain why no reunion occurred? If the colonists were thriving among allies, surely some sign would have been visible from the shoreline. Yet the silence remained. Another troubling question lingers in the carved word itself. The colonists had been instructed to carve a cross if they left under duress, but there was none. Advocates of the assimilation theory see this as proof they moved voluntarily. But what if the truth is darker? What if they had been forced to move not by friendly allies, but by necessity or threat, starvation, violence, or something else? The absence of the distress cross may not mean safety. It may mean they had no time to follow instructions. Even the timeline raises doubts. If the colonists joined the Croatoan, how long did they survive afterward? Did they thrive, intermarry, and carry on new lives for generations? Or did they die within a few years, erased by famine, war, or disease even after finding refuge? The evidence does not tell us. The mystery is not only where they went, but what became of them in the years that followed. Without graves, without written records, without artifacts firmly tied to specific names, we remain in the dark. Skeptics also note that declaring the mystery solved serves a purpose beyond scholarship. It satisfies public hunger for closure. It provides a clean narrative for headlines, documentaries, and classrooms. But history rarely ties itself into neat bows. To label Roanoke as solved may be less about certainty and more about convenience. The real story is messier, fragmented, and far less comforting. The settlers may have split, some dying of disease,
others starving, a few absorbed by neighboring tribes, perhaps even scattered across multiple locations. If so, there may not be single solution at all, but a mosaic of fates too complex to fit into one sentence. And then there is the enduring aura of the supernatural. The word CROATOAN has echoed through history in strange and unsettling ways, appearing in connection with disappearances far removed from Roanoke. While scientists dismiss such links as coincidence, the persistence of the legend suggests a cultural undercurrent we cannot ignore. Mysteries do not only live in evidence, they live in fear, in imagination, in the stories people tell to make sense of the unknown. Even if science one day produces undeniable proof, the legend of Roanoke will likely remain haunted by whispers of curses and vanishings that no science can erase. The greatest absence, however, lies in the human voice. We have no journals beyond the first year, no letters from survivors, no record of Virginia Dare growing into adulthood. The people themselves left nothing behind but silence. Without their words, every explanation feels hollow, a story told about them rather than by them. Their lives, their choices, their final moments remain unknown. Science can narrow the field of possibilities, but it cannot fill the silence where voices should have been. So, when we ask if the Roanoke mystery has truly been solved, the answer depends on what we mean by solved. If we mean that the colonists most likely assimilated with the Croatoan people, then yes, the evidence points strongly in that direction. But if we mean solved in the sense of absolute certainty, every question answered, every piece of the puzzle in place, then no. The mystery is still alive. Too many gaps remain. Too many silences echo. The truth may be that Roanoke was never one mystery, but many. Some settlers may have starved. Others may have died of disease. Still others may have joined the Croatoan. Fragmented fates lost to time, woven together into a single legend because we crave unity where none exists. Declaring the case closed risks erasing the complexity of what really happened. And so, in 2025, we stand at a strange crossroads. Science has given us new evidence, enough to build a narrative of survival and assimilation. But uncertainty clings like mist over the Atlantic. The colonists are not entirely lost, but they are not entirely found either. Their story is both solved and unsolved, a paradox that mirrors the human need for closure and the reality of history's silence. Perhaps that is the truest ending Roanoke can offer us. Not a neat solution, but a reminder that the past resists easy answers. The colonists vanished, leaving behind a word carved into wood and centuries of questions. We can dig, we can test, we can theorize, but in the end, the mystery belongs as much to imagination